All right, welcome to week 6 of the course. We're moving right along. Don't forget your wiki assignments, the normal discussion boards, and what else is there going on? Oh, and weekly quiz. Pay attention to extra readings that might be listed in the syllabus as TBA. You should be able to find those in the week 6 folder on Blackboard. All right, for today we're talking about historical geography. We're talking about the prehistory. And historical geography, it's a part of geography. It's a subfield of human geography. And, some authors like Johnston define it as geographies of the past and their relations with the present. Now, historical geography is different than history because it's talking about space. It spatializes events and puts them in the context of where and when they happen. So it's kind of a combination of where and when to explain why, right? A lot of historical geographers and people in other fields like anthropology and history that also kind of look at history and change over time in terms of humans and human cultures, they focus on how location, actually a place, like say Mexico, has been shaped by its physical, social, and cultural histories. And I'd argue that in any study that has a specific location, like Latin America, right, we have to pay attention to this. And I'm not even a historical geographer. The historical context of a place has a big influence on how events in that place take place today, right? So if you look at civil protest in Chile, which pops up every couple of years, it's modified by its nation's strongly oppressive past. During the Pinochet regime in the 80s, any kind of civil protest was smushed. I mean, just violently pushed down. Same thing in Brazil, the protests that we saw in the summer of 2013 were focused not on maybe like it was portrayed in the U.S. media, not on the rise in bus fares, but because Brazil was spending a massive amount of money on infrastructure for its large international sporting events like the Confederation Cup in 2013, the World Cup in 2014, and the Olympics, I believe, in 2016, which will be in Rio. All right. So there, people were protesting more about the spending of money on new infrastructure, but kind of ignoring the decrepit hospital and education system. And that's because the investment historically has gone to projects that benefit the wealthy rather than those who need it. And so that was kind of the big push there. So today we'll be focusing on one part of the historical geography of Latin America, and that includes basically all the time leading up to the permanent settlement of the region by Europeans. So you can think of it as like a long time ago until the year 1491. I'm going to be focusing more than just on dates and little factoids. We're going to focus on this kind of massive time period and sort of the trends that we can see. When I say it's a massive time period, we're talking up to 45,000 years in the past. There's direct evidence from the archaeological record that people have been in Latin America since around, at least in the Americas, since around 30,000 years ago, and probably even longer. Overall, though, newer genetic evidence indicates that the time period might be shorter, like in Latin America, maybe 15,000 years. No matter what research, what the date is, people have been in the Americas for a really long time. And actually, probably more of that time has been prehistorical than post-historical. Remember, prehistorical just means that nobody was around to write the history in such a way that we would recognize it as such today. Right? It's not like, caveman necessarily smashing rocks together. Okay, why do we focus on the kind of where and when, the historical geography? Well, in Latin America, it's been true that history was written by the victors. And that's changing a little bit, but to understand Latin America today, we need to understand its history. And, when we say prehistory, which is what we're really talking about today, we mean before recorded history, like I mentioned before. It's also a relative measure. So history, quote unquote, starts earlier in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East than it does in North America, South America, or even many parts of Africa where what was recorded may have been lost. Or what was recorded would have been in a verbal tradition, which was lost through slavery to a large extent. So, why do we focus on this in Latin America? Well, we often forget that before the Spanish and Portuguese and other colonial powers arrived, there were other people there. So who lived in Latin America before Columbus showed up in 1492? Well, there's a lot of them. You might say, oh yeah, the Mayans, the Incas, and the Aztecs. But there were many others. The Arawaks and Caribs made their home in the Caribbean. The Olmecs in Mexico before any other of the prehistoric populations there. The Tupi and the Gay in the Amazon in the central part of South America. The Marajoara on Earth's largest freshwater island at the mouth of the Amazon. These civilizations were all pretty advanced and all existed before the Spanish showed up. Some of them you're familiar with, of course, others not so much. Of course, there's we'll call them the big three, the Inca, the Maya, and the Aztec. And you'll see this map all over the place whenever the subject of kind of pre-European Latin American cultures come up. So you can see there are three, the Inca, the Maya, and the Aztec again. And these three often get lumped together in people's minds. And actually, I've done that a little bit in this class. But they're not the same. And they didn't exist at the same time at all, pretty much. A little bit of overlap, but not really. They were very distinct, very different. But if you look at this map, notice that we don't really have too much in the way of archaeological sites outside of these colored regions here, which correspond to the Inca and the Andes, the Maya on kind of in Belize, parts of El Salvador, Guatemala, and then Mexico, and then around Mexico City, the Aztecs, right? So the impression that a lot of people are left with is that Latin America was mostly devoid of people, and that's not actually true. Bill Denovin, a historical geographer and Latin Americanist, has been working in Latin America for a long time, actually wrote an article called The Pristine Myth, which you'll be reading this week. And in it, he argues that actually Latin America was highly peopled, meaning lots of people there, and that those people made massive adjustments and changes to the environment that we can observe today, right? But anyway, before the arrival of the Europeans, there were probably a lot of people in the New World, maybe as many as 250 million, which would be about as many as there were in Europe. So when you think about that, the kind of colonial power showed up, and basically through more advanced, maybe, technology of war, they were able to really kind of decimate and destroy. Talking completely objectively about this, really hurt the populations of the Americas to the point where, 100 years after they arrived, population was much lower. So when Europeans arrived, about 250 million people in the New World, in Latin America. And, some of these people were living in highly developed societies, with big, complex social organizations, interactions with their environments, and really impressive earthworks and buildings, which we'll look at in a minute. And some of them, were probably even more extensive than we know of today, but they've been destroyed, or they've decayed, or kind of disappeared, right? We're going to talk about the big three in terms of the Inca, Maya, and Aztec, right? But we'll mention a few other civilizations that are important as well in a number of different ways. I'm not going to focus on some places that everyone knows about. Machu Picchu would be a good example. Yeah, it's a really great site. I'd love to visit it one day, maybe soon. One of them I can't stay away from, though, is Teotihuacán, because it's up here by Mexico City, right? It's a pretty massive and impressive archaeological site. It's really cool. It's important even today, so I'm going to talk about that one for sure. All right, let's start with Mesoamerica. So basically, remember, Mesoamerica is Middle America, or basically Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, right? Kind of Central America plus Mexico. It's not Middle America like the way you hear about it on cable news, right? And here it basically translates, Mesoamerica more or less translates to the place where maize grows, maize being corn, right? Everywhere else in the world refers to corn as maize. We got to use the word corn, whatever. I've mentioned in class that, the Mayan lived here. Basically, you could say Mesoamerica is the place where the Maya lived. You should know what I mean when I say Mesoamerica at this point, hopefully. In the grand scheme of things, Mesoamerica was home to actually more than just the Maya. A number of advanced civilizations lived there. They all focused on maize, corn, right? And this focus on agriculture led to later advances in civilization. Maize took some time to domesticate, but once it did, it served pretty impressively as an agricultural commodity crop. Right? Believe it or not, this maize or corn identity is actually pretty strong. If you read Michael Pollan's book, The Omnivore's Dilemma, he talks about how the Maya people literally considered themselves the people of the corn. And probably the only civilization on Earth to ever be more corn-centric than the Maya are Americans today. Most of what we eat has corn, some corn product in it, including things like guar gum or dextrose. I mean, all these things are corn products, corn syrup, all of that, right? Anyway, civilizations in this area were advanced. They didn't really have a lot of domesticated animals, right? And the ones that they did have weren't very large. So they had dogs, turkeys, and ducks, but they didn't have cows or bison or anything like that. They didn't have metal tools. They actually, even though they built some fantastic earthworks and really big cities, they didn't use the wheel, which is kind of mind-blowing, right? These civilizations were wheelless. And occupation of the world goes back pretty far, probably around 28,000 years, although populations weren't significant until around 10,000 years ago. So that's Mesoamerica. In terms of the civilizations there, we had 5 of them. We had the Olmec, 900 to 400 years BCE. What's BCE? Before the current epoch. BCE roughly translates, it's the kind of religion-neutral way of saying BC AD. Right, before Christ or after his death. We're going to go with these BCE and CE. CE is current era, and BCE is before current era. We're going to go with these because it's the way the archaeological and historical geography literature goes. It's also considered those with faiths that are not Judeo-Christian. Right. So the Olmec lived 900 to 400 BCE. Right. So we're talking about 3,000 years ago or so. The Teotihuacán came around 300 BCE to about 900 CE. 900 CE would be about when, about 900 AD, right? Mayan, 200 CE to 1200 CE. Mexica, actually, and Aztec, 1325 to 1521. And then the Tarascan people, sometimes called Purepechas, were from 1200 to 1525. After 1521 to 1525, the Spanish were pretty much ruling with an iron fist in Mexico, and these civilizations all kind of fell apart. Some, though, overlap, right? So, like the Aztecs and the Tarascans overlap substantially. Others totally separate, like the Mayas and the Aztecs, which people often group together. They're not the same, okay? Maybe a good quiz question there. All right, let's put this in perspective. So, number of contemporary events. The pyramids at Giza, we believe they were finished around 2500 BCE. So, much older than any of these populations, right? The city of Jericho in the Middle East, right? Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho. You might have sung that song in Sunday school or something like that. That fell in 1400 BCE, according to the archaeological evidence. So still a long time before these populations. The Romans made it to England around 130 BCE. So right around the time when Teotihuacán was kind of in the middle, right? And but after the Olmecs. The first Roman Empire went from 63 BCE to 14 CE. So again, this period here. Vesuvius erupted and destroyed Pompeii in 79 CE. So again, during the Teotihuacan period. The height of the Roman Empire, 96 to 192 CE. So right around the Teotihuacan, just before the Mayans, and then the first medieval crusade happened at about 1095 CE, so during the period of the Maya, but before the Aztec and Tarascan, right? Just to give you a little bit of historical context with these dates with a baseline, right? Okay, the Olmecs. These were the first group in Mesoamerica. They're considered primordial, or kind of a mother culture for Mesoamerica, and we don't know that much about them. So these people lived a couple hundred years before the Romans, and they were powerful economically and located in an important regional trade region, and that increased their influence. They were probably the first recognized civilization of Mesoamerica, and they're famous for their stone heads. These Olmec heads are huge, and we find them a lot along the Gulf Coast of Mexico. They can be over 20 tons. They're carved from stone, not available in the region. So if you've ever kind of looked at Stonehenge, kind of the same deal. The stone's not from right around Stonehenge. These heads are not from right around the Gulf Coast of Mexico. Each head's unique, and it's unique to each Olmec settlement or center, and they're around 12 feet high. They're pretty big. The Olmecs were actually the source of a lot of organized or advanced things for the time. Sporting events that looked surprisingly like basketball were invented by the Olmecs. Basically, you had to get a rubber ball through a hoop. Religious rituals based upon bloodletting, maybe human sacrifice. You might see some Discovery Channel show where that's sensationalized. We're actually not sure that the Olmecs did this or not. They invented writing. So you can see that here. It's their Olmec text and calendar. Somewhat similar to the glyphs that the Maya produced, but not the same. They invented the zero, one of the earliest cultures to do so. So all around the world we have cultures invent the zero independent of one another and at different times, right? I mentioned this before, but they were probably the first culture to recognize magnetic north, and they invented the magnetic compass. Pretty impressive, right? And they probably developed the highly accurate Mesoamerican calendar, which is actually more accurate than the European calendar that came around about 1,000 years later. If any of these things sound familiar, you bet they do, because the Mayans and Aztecs are known for a lot of these things too, but they got them from the Olmecs. That was the original. That's why the Olmecs are primordial. They're the mother culture for this region. Okay. Teotihuacan is another place. It's just a pretty spectacular area. So during this period, this is 300 BCE to 900 CE. So we're talking about almost 1,500 years, right? 1,600 years of time span. During this period, Europe was in the Dark Ages, so there's pretty much no political or cultural organization at all in Europe. And here in Mexico, this city, Teotihuacan's near present-day Mexico, it's huge, and it's built on a grid. You today, if Teotihuacan existed, if you were transported there, let's say, you would be able to find your way around because it's built on a grid, which is the way many of our cities today are. And Teotihuacan means place of the gods in the Mexica language. The Aztecs actually found these people, the Teotihuacan Mexica people, or Teotihuacan. They found them, and this civilization for the Aztecs was as much a kind of archaeological as it is for us. So because the Aztecs found them, they got to name everything, but they are, the Teotihuacan and the Aztecs are not the same. For a long time, people thought this Teotihuacan city was ceremonial only, and people came here for religious reasons, but it turns out that probably not. Probably people lived here, And the pyramids were not thought to be tombs, but it turns out that they actually were. Human sacrifice, the Teotihuacan did do this. It wasn't uncommon. And they were very powerful. If you look at the area that they had influence over, here's Teotihuacan the city, and here is their cultural influence. Pretty significant. Most of present-day Mexico. Huge, right? The city itself, if you look down the main avenue toward it's called the Avenue of the Dead, toward the temple there at the end, right here in the middle, that's called the Temple of the Moon, right? You can kind of notice that the Teotihuacan might have been inspired by something. In the background there, the pyramid looks quite a lot like the mountain in the background, right? The Teotihuacan were very identified a lot with their landscape. Here's the Temple of the Moon looking toward the Temple of the Sun. So this is on the Temple of the Moon. A friend of mine took this photo looking toward the Temple of the Sun, which is this one here. It's really a huge complex of pyramids. Lots of houses were here, but they probably didn't survive the years of neglect. And it turns out this city was capable of supporting about 100,000 people. Maybe, well, look. So this civilization came around, BCE 300, right, and existed till 900 CE. So basically 900, the year 900, let's go with, was when they started to fall apart. 100,000 people lived in this city, which was huge for the period of time. A lot of researchers kind of laughed that you could have this many people, but archaeology keeps supporting this idea. And to put it into perspective, you think London's a big city? It is a big city. It didn't reach 100,000 people till the year 1300. Paris didn't reach 100,000 people till the year 1200. So this city was massive and much earlier, a couple hundred years earlier than either of those cities made it to that population figure. Well, why did the Teotihuacán collapse? We're not really sure. But the success of the city was based on rich agriculture and a corn-based food economy, and then also trade in obsidian, volcanic glass, right? The city's near some mines for obsidian, and it was traded throughout the region because it's sharp. When you don't have metal, which the Teotihuacan didn't have, how do you cut things? You use volcanic glass, obsidian. The downfall might have happened due to internal revolt, could be, and we kind of glean that from selective vandalization at various sites, on ruined sites. Poverty may have been an issue as trade routes were cut off by rival groups, and eventually probably the city collapsed upon itself economically. The result might have been something like the Detroit race riots. Everyone who could leave the city left and moved to fringes of the urban area or rural zones, right? So, we don't know actually for sure what happened to that Teotihuacan. All right, next we're looking at the Maya. So the Maya lived primarily in this area here, this red area. I had to steal this map from Wikipedia because I didn't have time to make one myself. Basically, it includes parts of Mexico, including the Yucatan Peninsula, Belize, Guatemala, and Honduras. And we've called this Middle America in this class so far. One of the best known and advanced civilizations in the Americas. It continued the Olmec tradition of advanced writing, calendar, mathematics, astronomy, navigation. And we're sure the Maya invented zero. The Olmecs probably did, but we're not 100% sure. We definitely know the Maya had it. They built with a lot of limestone because if you remember from the landforms material, this area here has a lot of karst topography, limestone topography. And so their ruins aren't as well preserved as many cultures because limestone erodes very rapidly under precipitation conditions. So the Maya were actually many different groups known together as Mayan. There were highland groups that used terraces for intensive agriculture and lowland groups, kind of living in low areas, that used slash and burn agriculture. They're well known for textiles, and actually they have strong political organization even today after centuries of marginalization. If you remember hearing about the political turmoil in Chiapas with the Zapatistas, It actually involved a reassertion of indigenous identity. In Guatemala, during civil war there, many government troops mistreated rural Mayans because they thought they were aiding the rebels. The Maya are known to be strong in their kind of organization, right, even today. Here's one of their kind of high civilization ruins. It's the ceremonial center known as Tikal. It's overgrown with tropical forest. It's actually one of the most famous Mayan sites, but more of them get discovered all the time, even though this area has is pretty well developed. There's still plenty of forests that are hiding Mayan ruins. Right? One cool thing about the Maya is they never went away. They just kind of got assimilated. So in contrast to a lot of the other groups that we're talking about today, here's a contemporary Mayan altar at Tikal. So they're still around today. You can still find people who call themselves Maya. The fall of the Maya. How come? Why did the Maya fall? Well, two things, probably. There's a lot of debate about this, but in highland areas, people think probably the Maya overused their environment, especially as drought took place. So they had a very intensively managed agricultural landscape that relied on irrigation. When drought hits, especially an extended drought, your agriculture falls and your civilization falls apart. The other might have been intercity conflicts. So warfare, between cities made life difficult, and that might have led to a similar kind of urban exodus as the Teotihuacán experienced. As organization of civilization started to fracture, people got out of town, basically. Next up, we have the Mexica Aztec people, the Mixtec people. They came from the north, and they settled in swampy central Mexico. They built Tenochtitlan at the present site of Mexico City. So remember, the Teotihuacan were before the Aztecs, but the Aztecs settled really close to where the Teotihuacan did. They were very advanced. They brought some of the Olmec innovations further along, which they probably encountered once they arrived in this part of the world, coming from northern Mexico. And they brought things like the calendar, which is actually shown here. And in 1521, the Spanish actually encountered the Aztecs, and the Aztecs are the ones that they kind of interacted with in Mexico. Right? The Aztec Empire was not as extensive as some of the other ones. It covered some of the same areas, the Olmecs and Teotihuacan, but the Aztecs were interlopers. Trade was important to them, as well as tribute or tax, which was recorded in the Codex. So it's interesting, they actually, most of their writing was for tax record purposes in the Aztec nation, if you will. Currency they typically traded with in cocoa or cotton blankets, and they traded at weekly and daily markets. Writing and records actually, even though they came along after the Maya, the writing and record keeping was less developed than them. And really it was just for, like I said before, tax reporting purposes. Warfare was a way of life with the Aztecs, and it was undertaken primarily to extract revenue and find victims for their constant human sacrifice. This is the empire, or the Latin American culture that's associated with human sacrifice. This isn't to say that they were not advanced. The Aztec basically built Tenochtitlan, which is a water city, linked to the mainland by a causeway. This is a colonial era drawing of it. So here's the city, here's the causeway, and there were canals linking all of these neighborhoods together. Very advanced agriculture took place on these artificial gardens called chinampas. Most of these, most people refer to these as floating islands, but they weren't really. They were infilled land. And despite being trade focused and being bloodthirsty, they were actually very knowledgeable of their environment. So one thing that's pretty interesting is, as we've learned more about the Aztecs, it turns out that they had a soil classification system. This is what it is, and it's actually almost as developed as the one that we use today. Right? So they have basically alluvium clay, hard pan sand, and here, they have highly categorized soils, focused mainly around agriculture. Okay, well, the Aztecs weren't the only ones going on. They were contemporary with the Tarascan or Purepechas civilization. We don't know a whole lot about them. We don't hear about them a lot. They were rivals with the Aztecs. They lived kind of on the west coast of Mexico, a little bit kind of close to Acapulco. They weren't known to write, but they worked with metal. So they had this technology advancement that was different than the Aztecs. The Aztecs didn't really have metal. The Tarascan people did. So they were never conquered by the Aztecs. But we don't know that much about them today. The range didn't overlap with their enemies. But they did trade with the folks to the south, right? So here's their range. So the Aztecs were all down here. Probably the Tarascan people kind of held them at bay from conquering areas further to the north. All right, the last of the big three, the Inca. One thing to point out is they were the most recent, but they were probably also the most powerful pre-European civilization. They were pan-Andean, meaning they conquered basically or had domain over the entire Andes mountain range. And they're known for amazing stonework, which you can see in Cusco and Machu Picchu. And then they had this huge system of roads in the harsh Andes. They're really more like paths rather than like highways. But their empire was entirely highland areas, so upland areas, not low places. Cusco, Peru was the capital, and Quechua was the official and enforced language, so they dominated other languages. They had heartily irrigated agriculture, and all production was taxed by the state. And they fell in 1532 when Francisco Pizarro killed the emperor Atahualpa. And because the emperor was supposed to be basically God incarnate, the empire collapsed. Now, before this, though, the empire was already pretty much over because all of its leadership had died of smallpox, which came with Europeans. Most people don't realize, but by the time the Spanish arrived, the peak of the Inca had already passed. Most people were actually pretty anti-Inca due to warfare and tribute costs. Like taxes were too high, so they were ready to rebel. So if you look at the evolution over time, these darker red areas, this is 12, kind of further back in time, 1230, the year 1230, 1400, they expand out to here, the Inca do. By 1463, they're kind of through here. By 1493, they've more or less encompassed the entire Andes. But then by 1525, they've kind of surrendered or retreated into these white areas here by Quito, by Tumbes, and kind of here in northern Peru. Okay, so I mentioned the highland, intensely irrigated agriculture. They're really, you can see the Incan legacy throughout the Andes, which is basically a landscape significantly modified through the habitation of the Inca. And it was that way before the Spanish arrived. When we talk about agriculture, we'll talk about these terraces a little bit more. But Incan agriculture was intensive and required lots of labor to maintain. Okay, in terms of the high civilizations in Latin America, we had the Aztec, Tarascan, and their Olmec predecessors. We had the Maya in Mexico and Guatemala, and Inca in the Andes. But there are others that you should be aware of. How about the Caribbean? Well, we had the Carib people in the Lesser Antilles, and the Arawaks in the Greater Antilles. And then we had, and this is a Carib family portrayed by a European, right? And then we had the Amazon. So before we get to that, the Caribs came from the northern edge of South America and inhabited the islands of the Lesser Antilles. They were actually stealthy. They evaded Europeans a lot. They did practice cannibalism, but only for ritualistic purposes, basically religious purposes. But, when you watch like Pirates of the Caribbean, the only folks that, Captain Jack would have run into who were eating people would have been the Caribs. The Arawaks came from the same part of South America, but they were gradually displaced northward by the more aggressive Caribs. They actually made it all the way to Florida, And the Europeans described the Arawaks as more peaceful than the Caribs, which means they're probably easier to dominate. How about the Amazon? The Amazon is a different story. The prehistory of the Amazon is difficult to know because environmental conditions make it difficult to do archaeology. Not just difficult because it's hot and remote, but there was a lack of permanent building materials like stone, and that meant any major settlements were taken over by forests as they died out. So the forest is what people built and left behind in the Amazon. Remember when we talked about our vegetation lecture material, talked about human modification of the landscape? Well, this is where you can see it. There were a number of important tribes, including the Tupi and Gay. The common thinking was that there was a lack of civilizations in the Amazon, but today we're starting to show that this is probably really, really, really wrong. And you're reading for the discussion forum this week from the Charles Mann's book, 1491, really digs into that. It's pretty interesting. Cultural impacts of these civilizations remain today in place names and animal names and food names of just about everywhere in the Amazon. It's pretty interesting sometimes to run into very weird names. New research shows that Amazonians were more sophisticated than we thought. Large villages of more than 5,000 people with sedentary agriculture were probably pretty common. Previously, we thought that no more than 350 people could have been supported in a village, but we know now that's probably not the case. And there were complex trail networks between villages, communication networks as complex as the one in the Andes that link the Incas to each other. This kind of revisions to prehistory, they continue to go on. So if you look from your book, here's figure 7.2, talking about here's the Aztec, the Maya, Arawak, Carib. There's a couple others here, Inca, Guarani, Tupi, Gay. But if you check that out, compare it to this one on the right, which is from your Mann reading, chapter 9, you see plenty kind of a larger discussion of other groups that were here. There are many, many different indigenous groups in the Amazon, in the Pampas, right? There's much more complex stuff, and that's because we have new evidence. So I mentioned perhaps in this class Teja Preta, and that's part of writing the story. Teja Preta means dark earth, and we've figured out that not only have humans remade forests, but they've made soils. So this is part of rewriting the story of human habitation, especially in lowland areas. New archaeological techniques and sites and ethnobotanical research tend to say that large populations made huge impacts on the environment. Part of it, too, is that environmental determinism, the idea that the environment determines how humans behave completely, is not a favored view of things, and the most lively debate probably on the prehistory of Latin America is sort of in this area of Teja Preta. There's still some pretty strong opinions out there, including ones by Betty Meggers, who you'll learn about in your reading Charles Mann. She might be close to, she might be past retirement age, but she's still a very strong intellectual force. So anyway, make sure you don't forget those assigned readings on Blackboard, and don't forget the wiki assignment, and we'll see you next week.